The mist had not yet lifted from Thornwick Wood when Lynette Farrow slipped past the iron gate that was never meant to open for her. She knew the law of the place better than she knew her own reflection. No villager was permitted beyond the mossy boundary stone, not since the old Duke had closed the wood to all but his gamekeepers 12 years past, after a poacher's snare had crippled one of his hounds. The punishment for trespass was said to be severe. Some whispered it was transportation, others swore it was worse, though no one could say precisely what worse might mean, only that the words were spoken low, as though the wood itself might carry them back to the manor on the wind. Lynette did not care what the punishment was. Her grandmother's lungs rattled worse each night, and the only herbs that eased her breathing grew nowhere else but in the damp hollow beneath the old oaks, where the frost never quite reached, and the moss stayed soft enough to shelter the pale, star-shaped flowers of lungwort long after the frost had killed every other green thing in the parish. So she went at dawn, when the gamekeepers were still abed, and the light was too thin for any watchman to trust his own eyes. She went with a basket over her arm, and her heart beating high in her throat, and she told herself, as she always did, that fear was a poor excuse for letting someone she loved die slowly in a cold bed. She did not know, that particular morning, that she was not alone in the wood. She did not know that a man stood not 30 paces behind her, silent as the mist itself, watching the way she knelt in the wet grass, and spoke softly to the plants before she cut them, as though asking their permission. She did not know that his coat, though plain and mud spattered like any gamekeeper's, hid hands that had signed deeds and treaties, or that the eyes following her every movement belonged to Julian Ashworth, 9th Duke of Rothermere, master of every acre she was trespassing upon. He had come to the wood that morning expecting to catch a poacher. He had not expected to find a woman who murmured an apology to the earth before she took anything from it. He told himself he would confront her. He told himself this for 11 mornings, and each morning he found some reason not to. It had begun, if it could be said to have a beginning, 3 weeks earlier, when Julian's steward had come to him with a ledger full of missing hairs and a face full of suspicion. Someone was entering the private wood, the steward said, and taking game meant for the manor's own table. The old gamekeeper, half blind and half deaf, had seen nothing. The younger one insisted a shape moved through the trees before sunrise, quick and quiet, gone before he could raise his lantern. Julian, restless in a house grown too silent since his brother's death, had welcomed the excuse to leave it. He told his aunt, Lady Prudence, that he intended to ride to London on estate business. Instead, he borrowed a gamekeeper's coat, roughened his hands with dirt, and let his valet believe he had gone hunting alone, as he sometimes did when grief pressed too close for company. He did not go to catch a poacher stealing hares. He went to escape a house that had begun, of late, to feel less like a home and more like a negotiation. The negotiation had a name, and the name was Corisande Valley. She was his cousin twice removed, elegant, accomplished, and entirely aware that a marriage between them would settle both families' debts in a single stroke. Lady Prudence had been arranging the match since Julian's brother's death had made him duke, speaking of it not as a possibility, but as a certainty already decided, the way one speaks of the weather changing with the season. Julian had said nothing to discourage it. He had also said nothing to encourage it. He had simply retreated, morning after morning, into a wood where no one expected a duke to be, and there, on the 4th morning, he had first seen her. She had not seen him. That was the strange, unsettling pleasure of it, to watch a person exist entirely for herself, unwatched, unperformed. She spoke to the flowers. She hummed, low and tuneless, the sort of hum a person makes when they believe themselves entirely alone. She counted out coins from a worn purse and left them tucked beneath a stone near the boundary, though he could not think whom she meant to pay, since the wood belonged to no one who would ever find them there. He learned her habits before he learned her name. She came at dawn, always at dawn, 6 days out of 7, and always she left before the light grew strong enough to betray her. She never took more than her basket could hold. She never damaged a root she did not need. And once, when a fox lay tangled and bleeding in an old snare near the hollow, she had knelt beside it for the better part of an hour, murmuring to it as she worked the wire loose with hands that shook, though the creature might easily have torn her fingers to ribbons for her trouble. It was on the 11th morning that he finally spoke to her, and he had not planned to. The words simply arrived, unbidden, the way a confession arrives when a heart has been silent too long. "You'll want the willow bark as well," he said, stepping from the trees, "if it's a cough you're treating. Lunwort alone won't ease the tightness in the chest." She startled so violently she nearly overturned her basket. When she turned to him, her face was pale beneath its freckles, and her eyes, grey, he would later think, grey as the mist itself, held the particular fear of someone who has been caught doing something she cannot afford to be caught doing. "I meant no harm," she said quickly. "I take nothing that isn't given freely by the ground itself. I leave coin when I can, though I know it isn't owed to any man. Only I know," he said, before she could dig herself deeper into an explanation she owed him nothing of. "I've watched you leave it. 11 mornings now." Her breath caught. "You've watched me?" "I was meant to be catching a poacher," he said, and something in his voice, low and almost rueful, softened the words. "I found something else instead." She should have run. He could see the thought cross her face, the calculation of it, the weighing of consequence against escape. But something in his tone must have reassured her, or perhaps it was simple exhaustion. The particular exhaustion of a woman who has spent every dawn afraid, and has at last grown too tired to be afraid any further. "My grandmother is dying," she said instead plainly, as though the words cost her nothing, though he would learn later that they cost her everything. Slowly, the apothecary in the village charges more than we have, and even his remedies do less than what grows wild not a mile from our door. "I know I trespass. I know the law. I would ask only that you let me finish what I came to do, and I will not come again, if that is what you require." He looked at her for a long moment, this stranger in a wood that belonged to him, offering to surrender the only thing keeping her grandmother alive, rather than beg a gamekeeper's mercy. "What is your name?" he asked instead. "Lynette," she said. "Lynette Farrow. I am called Jules," he said, and the lie left his mouth so easily it frightened him. "I look after the eastern boundary. I've no authority to grant you leave to gather here, Miss Farrow, but I've less inclination to report you for it." Relief broke across her face like sunrise, and something in his chest, something that had been clenched tight since his brother's funeral, since the weight of a title he had never wanted settled onto shoulders that had not yet learned to carry it, loosened, just slightly, at the sight of it. "Then I thank you," she said, "more than I can say." She did not know that the man she thanked was the very duke whose law she broke. She did not know that the coins she left beneath the stone would sit untouched forever, because the ground she apologized to belonged, in the end, to him. He told himself, walking back to the manor that morning, with mud on his borrowed boots, and a strange lightness in his chest he had not felt in over a year, that he would explain himself the following day. He told himself the same thing the day after that, and the day after that, until the explaining became a debt too large to easily repay, and the disguise, which had begun as an accident, became something he was no longer certain he wished to surrender. Because Jules the gamekeeper's man was permitted things the Duke of Rothermere was not. Jules could sit on a fallen log, while Lynette showed him which mushrooms would kill a man, and which would merely make him regret his supper. Jules could laugh, freely and without calculation, at the dry, unexpected wit she wielded like a blade beneath her quiet manner. Jules could ask her questions about her life, her grandmother, her long-dead parents, the small cottage she kept with her own 2 hands, and receive honest answers, unweighted by the particular caution people reserve for a duke. The Duke of Rothermere, he was coming to understand, received very few honest answers from anyone. Lady Prudence, when he returned to the manor each morning with dirt beneath his nails, asked only whether the poacher had been caught, and seemed satisfied enough with his vague replies that she did not press further. She was occupied, in any case, with matters she considered far more pressing, namely, the growing certainty in her mind that Julian's marriage to Corisande Vere needed only the smallest push to become fact rather than plan. "She asked after you again," Lady Prudence said one evening, over a dinner Julian barely tasted, his thoughts still tangled in a wood some 3 miles distant. "Miss Vale. She wonders whether you intend to attend the Ashcombe ball. It would do you good, Julian, to be seen in company again. A year of mourning is respectable. Longer begins to look like avoidance." "Perhaps it is avoidance," Julian said, before he could stop himself. Lady Prudence's fork paused above her plate. Avoidance of what, precisely? He did not answer. He was thinking absurdly of a woman with grey eyes who did not know his name, who had spoken to him that very morning of the particular grief of losing a mother too young to properly remember her, and who had asked nothing of him in return but the small mercy of his silence. It could not last, of course. He knew this even as he continued it, morning after morning, week after week, watching the wood begin to soften from the last grip of winter into the first uncertain green of spring. He knew it the way one knows a debt will eventually come due, even while spending freely against it. In those weeks, the wood became something neither of them spoke of aloud, but both understood without needing to. Not merely a place, but a kind of sanctuary, cut off from the ordinary machinery of rank and duty that governed every other hour of their separate lives. Julian found himself counting the days not by the estate's ledgers or his aunt's letters of introduction, but by the small, accumulating catalogue of things he learned about Lynette Farrow, each one gathered as carefully as the herbs she cut. He learned that she had taught herself to read from a single battered book of remedies left behind by her mother, tracing the letters by candlelight until the words made sense, because no one in the village had thought a poor girl worth the expense of a governess. He learned that she had buried both her parents before her 12th year, her father to a fever and her mother, not long after, to a grief that had simply refused to lift, and that Agnes had taken her in without hesitation, though the old woman's own means were meagre enough to make the kindness a genuine sacrifice. "She never once made me feel a burden," Lynette told him one morning, sitting on the fallen log that had become, without either of them naming it so, their customary meeting place. "Even when there was barely bread enough for the both of us, she would give me the larger portion and claim she'd already eaten. I did not understand, as a child, what that cost her. I understand it now, and I mean to spend the rest of my life repaying it, however I can." "That is why you go into the wood," Julian said, "even knowing the risk." "That is why I would go into far worse than this would," Lynette said, "if it meant one more year of her company." He found, listening to her, that his own losses, a brother dead before his time, a father who had governed with cold competence rather than warmth, a mother who had retreated into fashionable society long before retreating finally into an early grave, began to feel less like wounds he carried alone, and more like something that could perhaps be set down beside another person's grief and made lighter for the sharing. He told her, in turn, of his brother, carefully, without revealing the particular details that might have betrayed his true rank, though even the careful telling left him raw in a way he had not expected. He spoke of a boy who had once been kind before ambition and duty had hardened him, of the strange guilt of surviving a sibling one had not always loved well, of the peculiar loneliness of inheriting responsibility for people who had never once been asked whether they wanted him at their head. "You speak as though guilt were a debt you owed simply for still breathing," Lynette observed once, watching him with an attentiveness that made him feel, uncomfortably, as though she had already guessed more of the truth than he had given her credit for. "I do not think your brother would begrudge you for living, Jules. I think, more likely, he would begrudge you for living badly, out of some misplaced penance you have decided to serve on his behalf." The words struck him with a force he had not anticipated, and it was some days before he could examine them without flinching. He had not realized, until she named it so plainly, how much of his retreat into the wood, into a false name and a borrowed coat, had been less about escaping his aunt's marriage schemes, and more about escaping the version of himself that grief and title had built around him like a second skin. Their conversations were not always so weighted. There were mornings of pure, uncomplicated lightness, a contest to see who could name more uses for a single sprig of rosemary, which Lynette won handily, to Julian's mock outrage, an afternoon, stolen against all sense, when he taught her to skip stones across the narrow stream that cut through the hollow, and she proved so hopeless at it that she laughed until she had to sit down in the wet grass, unable to catch her breath, while he laughed harder than he had in over a year at the sight of her failure. There were small gifts too, offered without ceremony. A length of ribbon he claimed to have found discarded near the manor's stables, though in truth he had ridden into the village specifically to purchase it, a jar of honey from the estate's own hives, left beside the boundary stone with no note attached, though she knew precisely who had left it. It was during one such ordinary morning, weeks before Corizande's cruel revelation, that Julian first understood the full weight of what he stood to lose. Lynette had brought, that day, a small posy of wildflowers gathered not for any remedy, but simply for their color, and she had woven them, without quite seeming to notice she was doing it, into a loose braid at the nape of her neck. "You look," he had said, before he could stop himself, "like something out of an old ballad, the sort where the shepherdess turns out to be a queen in disguise, and no one in the story is the least bit surprised, because they'd suspected it all along from the way she carried herself." "I am no queen," Lynette had laughed, though color rose in her cheeks at the compliment. "Only a girl with dirt beneath her fingernails, and a grandmother who needs her medicine before the frost returns tonight." "Perhaps," Julian had said quietly, watching her gather her basket to leave, "the ballads have it backward. Perhaps it is not always the shepherdess who turns out to be a queen. Sometimes, I think, it might be the other way entirely, a queen discovering, rather late, that she was only ever meant to be a shepherdess all along, tending something far more honest than a crown." He had not explained himself further, and she had not asked him to, though the look she gave him before she disappeared back through the mist-wrapped trees stayed with him for the rest of that day. And for many days afterward, a look that held, he was almost certain, the beginning of something neither of them yet had the courage to name aloud. It was this accumulation of small, unremarkable mornings, not any single grand event, but the slow, patient wait of dozens of ordinary hours spent in each other's company, that made the eventual unraveling so much crueler than it might otherwise have been. A lie discovered quickly can be forgiven quickly, or dismissed as a stranger's foolishness. A lie sustained across months of genuine intimacy cuts far deeper, because it does not merely deceive the mind. It reaches backward and threatens to poison every honest moment that came before it, until the person betrayed can no longer trust her own memory of happiness. This was precisely what Lynette feared, standing frozen in the market square with lavender and lungwort scattered at her feet. And it was precisely what Julian understood, walking toward her cottage door that final evening, that he would have to prove wrong. Not through apology alone, but through the slow, deliberate work of showing her that nothing true between them had ever depended on the lie that had merely sheltered it. The reckoning began, as such things often do, with an act of kindness that revealed too much. It was a morning in early spring, colder than it ought to have been, when Lynette arrived at the hollow with her basket and found, instead of solitude, a scene of quiet devastation. A tenant family's cottage, she recognized the Halorans, whose youngest boy she had once nursed through a fever, had burned in the night, struck by a spark from a poorly banked hearth, and the family now stood shivering at the wood's edge, with nothing but the clothes they had fled in. Julian, still in his gamekeeper's coat, arrived at the scene not long after her. Drawn by the smoke visible even from the manor, he found Lynette already among the Halorans, her own cloak wrapped around the shivering youngest child, her voice low and steady as she assessed which of them needed a physician most urgently, and which merely needed warmth and time. "They'll lose the roof entirely before the day is out," she said to him, not questioning why a mere gamekeeper's man had come running toward disaster rather than away from it. "They've nowhere to go. The estate ought to open the old dower cottage for them, at the least, until repairs can be made, but I don't suppose a groundskeeper has the authority to grant that." "No," Julian said carefully, "but I know someone who might be persuaded." He left her there, promising to return, and within the hour a message had reached the manor in his own hand, instructing the housekeeper to open the dower cottage and see the Halloran family fed and warmed at the estate's expense. The order signed simply J. Ashworth, which might, to an unsuspecting eye, have belonged to any minor official on the grounds. When he returned to the wood's edge, the Hallorans were already being led toward the promised shelter, weeping their gratitude to whichever unseen benefactor had granted it. Lynette turned to him, her eyes bright with something that made his chest ache. "You did that," she said. It was not a question. "I only carried the message," he said, which was, in its way, entirely true. "You carried it fast enough that a family isn't sleeping in a hedgerow tonight." She studied him with an intensity that made him feel, for the first time in longer than he could remember, thoroughly and uncomfortably seen. "You are not merely a groundskeeper, Jules. I don't know what you are. But you are not only that. I am whatever I need to be," he said, which was closer to a confession than he had intended to give. She did not press him further that day. But something had shifted between them. Some unspoken acknowledgement that the disguise, whatever its purpose, was thinning at the edges, and that a truth was gathering weight it could not carry much longer. The truth found its opening, not through his own courage, but through the machinations of Lady Prudence, who had grown weary of waiting for nature to run its course, and decided in her particular way to force the matter. She announced 3 days later that a betrothal ball would be held at the end of the month, not officially for Julian and Corisande, since no formal offer had yet been made, but arranged with such transparent intent that all of Rothermere's acquaintance understood precisely what it signified. Invitations were sent. Corisande herself began appearing at the manor with increasing frequency, gracious and lovely and utterly certain of the outcome she had been promised since childhood. Julian found himself trapped between two lives that could not coexist. In one, he was a duke expected to secure his family's fortunes through a marriage that made perfect bloodless sense. In the other, he was a man who had begun, somewhere in the quiet hours of a forbidden wood, to fall in love with a woman who did not know his name. He tried, twice, to end it cleanly. He told himself he would simply stop going to the wood, that Lynette would gather her herbs undisturbed, and eventually forget the gamekeeper who had shown her small kindnesses, and that he would marry Corisande and do his duty, and let the wood keep its secret buried beneath moss and mist, where it belonged. Both times, he found himself at the boundary stone before dawn, unable to stay away. "You seem troubled," Lynette observed on the second of these mornings, watching him with the particular attentiveness that had become, without either of them quite naming it, the truest form of intimacy either had known in years. "Is it your position? Has someone questioned your presence here?" "Something like that," he admitted. "You could tell me," she said gently. "I would not judge you for whatever burden you carry. I think perhaps you believe yourself the only one entitled to secrets, but I have carried a few of my own, Jules, and I have never once thought less of you for yours." He nearly told her then. The words rose in his throat, heavy and urgent. "I am not Jules. I have never been Jules. I am the man who owns every tree in this wood and every debt in this parish, and I am promised, or nearly promised, to a woman I do not love, while the woman I do love kneels in the frost, gathering herbs to save a grandmother she adores. But the confession, once spoken, could not be unspoken, and he was a coward in exactly the way that men of great power often are, brave enough to face armies of consequence in the abstract, and utterly unable to face the particular consequence of watching her face change when she learned the truth. So he said nothing, and the silence, once again, cost him more than speech ever could have. The truth arrived instead through cruelty, as truths so often do when courage fails to deliver them kindly. Corisande Vale, it transpired, was neither foolish nor blind. She had noticed Julian's frequent absences, his distracted manner, the mud that no amount of careful brushing entirely removed from his boots. She had her own maid make discreet inquiries among the estate's staff, and within a fortnight she possessed enough fragments of gossip to assemble a picture close enough to the truth to wound. She confronted Lynette directly, choosing her moment with the precision of a woman who understood exactly how much damage a well-placed word could do. It happened in the village, on market day, when Lynette had gone to sell a small surplus of dried herbs to help cover the cost of her grandmother's medicine. Corisande approached her with a smile so polished it might have passed, to an unsuspecting eye, for warmth. "You are the girl who gathers herbs in the Duke's private wood," Corisande said, without preamble. "I wonder if you know precisely whose company you've been keeping there." Lynette's stomach dropped, though she could not have said why. "I keep no company but my own, and the gamekeeper who has been kind enough to overlook my trespass." "Ah," Corisande said, and her smile deepened into something far less pleasant. "How charmingly you put it. The gamekeeper. I wonder, has this gamekeeper a name?" "Jules," Lynette said, though the word had begun to taste strange in her mouth, uncertain and hollow. "Jules Ashworth," Corisande said, watching her closely. "How very interesting that his family name should be identical to the Duke's own. Curious coincidence, don't you think, for a mere groundskeeper?" Lynette felt the ground shift beneath her, though she stood perfectly still. "I don't understand." "Then let me be plain, since kindness clearly hasn't served you well." Corisande's voice remained soft, almost pitying, which made the words that followed all the crueler. "The man you have been meeting at dawn in a forbidden wood is not a gamekeeper, Miss Farrow. He is Julian Ashworth, 9th Duke of Rothermere, master of every acre you have been trespassing upon, and betrothed, within the month, to me. I don't know what game he has been playing with you, whether cruelty or mere idleness, but I thought you deserved to know the truth before you made a greater fool of yourself than you already have." She left Lynette standing in the middle of the market, the basket of herbs slipping unnoticed from numb fingers, scattering dried lavender and lungwort across the cobblestones like something broken beyond repair. Lynette did not go to the wood the following morning, nor the morning after that. Julian waited at the boundary stone each dawn with a dread that grew heavier with every empty hour, until, on the third morning, he understood, with the particular clarity of a man watching his own worst fear made manifest, exactly what had happened, and precisely who had made certain it happened. He found her, eventually, not in the wood, but at the small cottage where she lived with her grandmother, and the sight of him, dressed, this time, not in a gamekeeper's rough coat, but in the clothes befitting his actual rank, having abandoned pretense the moment he understood pretense, could no longer serve any purpose but further cruelty, confirmed everything Corazande had told her, more thoroughly than any words could have. "You lied to me," Lynette said, before he could speak. Her voice was quiet, which frightened him far more than shouting would have. "Every morning, for months, you let me believe you were an ordinary man. You let me speak to you of my grandmother, of my fears, of things I have told no one else living, and the entire while you were laughing, I imagine, at how easily a poor apothecary's granddaughter could be made a fool of. I never laughed at you," he said, and the words came out rougher than he intended, raw with a desperation he had not expected to feel. "Lynette, I swear to you, not once, don't," she said. "Don't use my name as though you've earned the right to it. You don't know me, Your Grace. You know a woman you watch from the trees like game to be studied before the hunt. Was that the purpose of it? Some private amusement, to see how a common girl might behave when she believed herself unwatched by anyone of consequence?" "It began that way," he admitted, because he could not, in this moment of all moments, permit himself another lie. "I went to the woods suspecting a poacher. I found you instead, and I told myself I would confront you and be done with it. But then I watched you leave coin for ground that would never miss it, and nurse a fox that might have torn your hand to ribbons, and speak to withered flowers as though they deserved your gentleness, and I could not make myself stop watching. And then I could not make myself stop speaking to you. And somewhere in the middle of all that watching and all that speaking, whatever I intended stopped mattering at all. And yet you let me believe a lie for months," she said, though her voice had begun, very slightly, to waver. "Because the moment I told you the truth, I would cease to be a man you spoke to freely, and become instead a duke you addressed with careful distance and careful courtesy, the way the entire world addresses me now. And I could not bear to lose the only honest conversation I have had since my brother died." His voice broke, finally on the last words, and he did not try to hide it. "I was selfish, Lynette, I know that. I stole something from you that was not mine to take, your trust, given freely to a man who did not exist. But I never once mocked you. I have never in my life felt less inclined to mockery than I did in that wood, watching you be exactly, entirely yourself, unguarded in a way I have not been permitted to be since the day I inherited a title I never asked for." She was silent for a long moment, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as though holding some fracture closed by will alone. "You are betrothed," she said finally, "to Miss Vale." "I am not," he said. "There has been no formal offer. My aunt has arranged the appearance of one, for reasons that suit her far more than they suit me, but I have signed nothing, promised nothing, and I do not intend to. That is not what the entire parish believes, Your Grace, nor what Miss Vale herself clearly believes. What the parish believes is not my concern," he said. "What you believe is the only thing I find myself unable to bear getting wrong." Something in her expression softened, dangerously, before hardening again, as though she had caught herself on the edge of forgiveness too quickly offered. "You should go," she said. "My grandmother is resting, and I have herbs to prepare, and you have a betrothal ball to attend, whatever your aunt has decided to call it. I think it best, Your Grace, if you do not return to the wood." He left because there was nothing else to do, and because he understood, with the particular ache of a man who has finally recognized his own fault too late to easily mend it, that trust broken through deception could not be repaired through mere insistence, however sincere. It would need to be earned again, slowly, through action rather than apology, and he was not certain he had been given the chance to try. The days that followed were among the darkest Julian had known since his brother's death. He attended the preparations for the ball with the hollow obedience of a man performing a role rather than living a life, while Lady Prudence, oblivious to the true source of his distraction, mistook his silence for the natural gravity of a man approaching an important decision. "You will announce it at the ball," she informed him, with the satisfaction of a woman watching a long campaign near its conclusion. Corazande has waited long enough. And frankly, Julian, so have I. The estate's finances cannot bear indefinite delay, and a union with the Vale fortune would settle every debt your brother left unpaid. I have not agreed to marry Miss Vale, Julian said. You have not disagreed, either, which in matters such as this amounts to the same conclusion. Lady Prudence's expression sharpened. Unless there is some other obstacle I ought to know of, some entanglement beneath your station that has made you suddenly reluctant to do your duty? He did not answer, and his silence, to a woman as perceptive as Lady Prudence, was answer enough. I have heard, she said slowly, a rumour. Something about a gamekeeper seen gathering herbs with a village girl each dawn. I dismissed it as servants' gossip, unworthy of attention. I begin to wonder if I dismissed it too quickly. Whatever you have heard, Julian said, concerns no one's honour but my own. It concerns the entire estate. If it distracts you from the marriage that will save it, Lady Prudence snapped. I have buried one nephew already, Julian. I will not watch the title he left behind crumble into debt, because the second one could not resist the charms of some apothecary's girl beneath a hedgerow. The words struck harder than she likely intended, and Julian left the room before he said something he could not take back, though the encounter left him with a clarity he had lacked before. He understood, now, precisely how much resistance stood between himself and any future with Lynette, and precisely how little that resistance mattered, weighed against the alternative of a lifetime, spent married to convenience rather than love. Meanwhile, in the small cottage at the wood's edge, Lynette nursed her own private grief, made sharper by circumstances she had not anticipated. Her grandmother's condition had worsened in the days since the confrontation in the market, the damp spring air settling into her lungs with a persistence no remedy seemed able to ease. You have not gone to gather herbs this week, Agnes Farrow observed one evening, her voice thinner than it had been even a month before. You always go, my girl, rain or shine, Duke's law or no. Something has happened. Nothing worth troubling you over, Lynette said, though her hands, occupied with steeping a tincture that grew less effective by the day, betrayed a tremor she could not fully hide. I am dying, child, not blind, Agnes said, not unkindly. Tell me. So Lynette told her of the gamekeeper who was not a gamekeeper, of months of stolen mornings that had felt, for the first time since her parents' deaths, like something resembling happiness, and of the cruel unveiling that had revealed the entire foundation of that happiness, to be built on a lie she had not been permitted to see. Agnes listened in silence, her breath rattling softly with each inhale, until Lynette had finished. And do you believe, Agnes asked, that he lied to wound you, or that he lied because he was afraid of losing the one honest thing left to him? Does it matter which? Lynette asked. A lie is a lie, regardless of its motive. It matters a great deal, Agnes said. I have watched liars in my time, my girl, more than I care to count. And there is a particular difference between the ones who deceive to take something from you, and the ones who deceive because they are terrified of what honesty will cost them. I think, from what you've told me, your Duke belongs to the second kind. That does not excuse him. But it does not make him a villain, either, only a coward, and cowardice, unlike cruelty, can be mended. If a man finds enough courage in the end, he is to marry Miss Vale, Lynette said. Whatever kindness he has shown me, it changes nothing about what he must become, a duke, married to a woman of his own rank, settling debts and securing fortunes, while I remain exactly what I have always been. And what is that? Agnes asked, with a faint, knowing smile. A woman clever enough to save an old fox's leg from a snare, gentle enough to nurse a dying stranger's burned family before her own grief had even cooled, and honest enough that a duke chose to spend every dawn he could steal in your company, rather than in the company of the woman his family has chosen for him. I do not think you know, my girl, quite how remarkable you are. But I suspect he does. Lynette said nothing further that night, though her grandmother's words settled into her chest like a seed she could not yet name, waiting for whatever conditions might allow it to grow. The ball arrived 3 days later, and with it, the crisis that would finally force every hidden truth into the open. Julian stood at the edge of the ballroom, surrounded by candlelight and silk, and the particular glittering emptiness of a gathering, assembled entirely around an announcement he had not yet agreed to make. Corizande, radiant in pale gold, moved through the room accepting congratulations for an engagement not yet formalized, with the serene confidence of a woman who has never once considered the possibility of refusal. Lady Prudence found him near the terrace doors, her expression carrying the particular steel of a woman who has run out of patience. "The guests grow restless," she said. "They expect an announcement, Julian. I have arranged everything precisely as it should be arranged. All that remains is for you to say the words." "I cannot," Julian said. "You can, and you will," Lady Prudence said, her voice dropping low enough that only he could hear it. "Whatever infatuation has taken hold of you, whatever village girl has caught your fancy beneath a hedgerow, it cannot outweigh the survival of this family. Your brother left debts that would have ruined us within 2 years, had I not begun arranging this match the very week of his funeral. I did not do it for my own comfort, Julian. I did it because I have watched this family teeter on the edge of ruin for a decade, and I will not watch it fall now. Not for the sake of your infatuation with a girl who gathers weeds in the mud." "She is not merely a girl who gathers weeds," Julian said, and something in his voice, steady now in a way it had not been in weeks, silenced whatever Lady Prudence had intended to say next. "She is the first honest thing to happen to me since my brother died, and I have spent the past fortnight discovering precisely how much I am willing to lose in order to keep her in my life, if she will still have me. I will not announce a betrothal to Miss Vale tonight, Aunt Prudence. Not tonight, and not any night hereafter." He left her standing at the terrace doors, her expression caught somewhere between fury and disbelief, and made his way through the glittering crowd toward the entrance, intent on riding, that very night, to the small cottage at the wood's edge, where he intended, finally, to say every honest thing he had swallowed for months out of cowardice, disguised as caution. He did not reach the door before Corizande intercepted him. Her composure cracked at last into something far sharper. "You mean to humiliate me," she said, low and furious. "In front of every person who matters in this county, you mean to walk away from an arrangement your own aunt has spent a year assembling, for the sake of some apothecary's granddaughter who gathers herbs in a forbidden wood." "I mean to be honest," Julian said, "with you, and with her, and with myself, for the first time in longer than I care to admit. I am sorry, Corizande, for whatever hurt this causes you. You deserve a husband who chooses you entirely, and I cannot be that man, because I have already given whatever choosing I have left to someone else." He rode from the manor that night with a speed that startled his own groom, and arrived at the small cottage near midnight, his heart pounding with something far more urgent than the ride itself could explain. He found the cottage dark, and for one terrible moment believed himself too late, that Lynette had gone, that Agnes had worsened, that whatever fragile hope had begun to grow between them had already withered beyond saving. Then the door opened, and Lynette stood there, a single candle in her hand, her expression caught between astonishment and something far more vulnerable. "Your Grace," she said, "it is nearly midnight. What has happened?" "I refused the betrothal," he said, before she could say anything further, before his own courage could fail him again, as it had failed him so many times before. "I stood in a ballroom full of every person whose opinion I have spent my entire life being taught to value, and I told them I would not marry Miss Vale, Because I have already given my heart to a woman who taught me, without ever intending to, what it means to be loved honestly rather than strategically. I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness. I know the lie I told you cannot be simply unmade by wanting it undone. But I could not spend one more night pretending I was capable of marrying anyone but you, Lynette Farrow, whatever the cost to my family's fortune, whatever scandal it brings upon my name. Lynette stood very still, the candle trembling slightly in her hand, casting shifting light across a face caught between disbelief and a hope she had been too afraid to let herself feel. Your aunt will never forgive such a choice, she said softly, nor will society. I am nothing, Your Grace. No fortune, no family name worth speaking of, nothing to offer a duke beyond a cottage and a dying grandmother, and hands too rough from honest work to ever pass for a lady's. You gave me the only honest months I have known since my brother died, Julian said. You gave me a version of myself I had forgotten existed, a man who could sit on a fallen log and laugh, without calculation, who could speak of grief without performing it, who could be simply Jules, imperfect and uncertain, and be loved regardless. I do not care what my aunt forgives, or what society whispers. I care only whether you can forgive the lie I told you, and whether there remains, beneath that lie, enough truth for you to build something real with me. For a long moment, Lynette said nothing, and Julian felt the entire weight of the past months settle upon that silence, uncertain whether it would break toward hope or toward final refusal. Then she stepped forward, setting the candle carefully upon the windowsill, and reached for his hand with fingers that no longer trembled. I forgave you the moment I understood why you lied, she said. I was only waiting to see whether you had courage enough to prove it meant something. I think, Your Grace, you have finally proven it. Before he left the cottage that night, Julian took her hand once more, turning it gently palm upward, tracing the small calluses that marked years of honest labor, the marks of a woman who had earned everything she possessed, rather than inherited it. I want to be plain with you, he said, about precisely what accepting me would mean, so that you enter into it with clear eyes rather than the flattery of midnight promises. My aunt will not welcome you easily. Society will whisper, for a season at least, that you trapped a grieving duke through cunning or witchcraft or whatever explanation proves easiest to believe rather than the truth, which is far less interesting to gossip about, that you were simply, entirely yourself. And that proved enough. There will be women who snub you at gatherings you are obligated to attend, and men who address you with a courtesy so exaggerated it becomes its own form of insult. I cannot promise you an easy life, Lynette. I can promise you only an honest one, and my whole heart within it, for whatever that is worth against a title's worth of difficulty. I have spent my whole life being underestimated, Lynette said, meeting his eyes without flinching. I have been overlooked at market for finer ladies with fuller purses, dismissed by physicians who assumed a poor girl's remedies could hold no value beside their own expensive ignorance, and pitied, more times than I can count. For a grandmother's illness I have never once considered a burden, rather than a privilege to bear. I think, Your Grace, I have rather more practice enduring whispered judgment than you might expect. It will not frighten me away, if that is your worry. It is not my only worry, he admitted, but it is the one I feared most to raise, and you have answered it more completely than I had any right to hope. What followed was not the swift, uncomplicated triumph such moments often promise in lesser tellings, but something slower, more deeply earned, in keeping with everything that had come before it. Agnes Farrow, informed the following morning of the Duke's intentions, regarded him with the particular sharpness of a woman who had survived a great deal and trusted very little easily. You will not disguise yourself again, in this house or any other, she informed him, with a directness that startled his household staff when they later heard the tale repeated. My granddaughter has had enough of men who are not entirely what they claim to be. If you intend to court her, Your Grace, you will do so as precisely what you are, with no pretense left standing between you." "I intend exactly that," Julian said, and meant it entirely. Lady Prudence's opposition, predictably, proved fiercer and more prolonged. She refused, for nearly a month, to receive Lynette at the manor, and made her disapproval known throughout the county with a thoroughness that left Lynette enduring whispered judgment each time she ventured into the village. But even Lady Prudence's resolve could not withstand, indefinitely, the sight of her nephew transformed, steadier, warmer, more present in the running of the estate than he had been since his brother's death, his grief finally finding somewhere useful to settle, rather than curdling endlessly inward. There were harder days than that first month suggested too, days Lynette did not speak of easily even to Julian, when she would return from the village to find whispers following her like a second shadow. Women who had once nodded to her kindly in the market now crossing the square to avoid speaking with her at all, as though her sudden elevation had transformed her, overnight, into someone dangerous rather than simply someone fortunate. A particular afternoon stayed with her longer than most, when she had gone to purchase thread for mending, and overheard, quite by accident, two merchants' wives discussing her in tones that assumed she could not hear, wondering aloud how long it would be before the Duke tired of his rustic amusement, and set her aside for a more suitable match, the way gentlemen so often did with women beneath their station once the novelty had worn thin. She did not tell Julian of this particular cruelty for nearly a week, ashamed in some small stubborn corner of her heart that the words had wounded her as deeply as they had, when she had told herself she was prepared for exactly this kind of judgment. It was Agnes, in the end, who noticed her granddaughter's unusual quiet and drew the truth from her by the fire one evening. "You must tell him," Agnes said, when Lynette had finished. "Not because you need him to defend you, my girl. You have never needed defending, not once in your life that I have witnessed. But because a marriage built on one partner, quietly swallowing pain to spare the other, is no marriage at all. It is merely a kindness performed alone, and kindness performed alone curdles, eventually, into resentment." Lynette told him that same night, and watched something harden in his expression that she had not seen since the night he had confessed his deception, not directed at her, but at the injustice of a world that would judge her worth by rumor rather than character. He said little in response beyond a quiet promise that he would not permit such talk to continue unanswered, and though she urged him not to make a public spectacle of her defense, believing such gestures would only feed the gossip further, she noticed, in the weeks that followed, a subtle but unmistakable shift in how the county's finer families addressed her, invitations that had been quietly withheld now arriving with polite regularity, and a marked coolness from Julian toward any acquaintance who had spoken carelessly of his wife's origins, conveyed not through confrontation, but through the simple, devastating tool of withdrawn favor, which among people who depended so heavily on a duke's goodwill, proved far more persuasive than any argument could have been. The turning point with Lady Prudence herself came, in the end, not through grand gesture, but through quiet proof of character, in precisely the manner the entire courtship had been built upon. When a fever swept through the tenant cottages that winter, it was Lynette who moved among the sick with her herbs and her steady hands, saving more lives than the county's official physician managed, including, in a twist even Lady Prudence could not dismiss, the life of Lady Prudence's own favoured lady's maid, whom Lynette nursed through 3 days of dangerous fever, without once asking for payment or recognition. Lady Prudence had come to the sick room herself on the 3rd night, expecting perhaps to find some evidence of the calculating opportunism she had long suspected in her nephew's choice of bride. Instead, she found Lynette exhausted past the point of pride, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her hair coming loose from its pins, pressing cool cloths to a servant's fevered brow with the same unhurried tenderness she had once shown a trapped and bleeding fox in a forbidden wood, asking for nothing in return but the girl's recovery. "Why do you trouble yourself so over a lady's maid who is nothing to you?" Lady Prudence had asked, unable to keep a note of genuine bewilderment from her voice. "She is a person suffering within my reach," Lynette had answered simply, not looking up from her work. "I have never required a person to be something to me before I found their suffering worth easing." Lady Prudence had said nothing further that night, but she had returned the following evening, and the one after that, ostensibly to check upon her maid's progress. Though she lingered longer each time than strict necessity required, watching Lynette work with an attention that had begun, slowly and against every instinct of her proud nature, to resemble something like respect. "I misjudged you," Lady Prudence admitted stiffly, some weeks later, watching Lynette tend the estate's small physic garden with the same careful attentiveness she had once shown a hollow full of wild lungwort. "I believed you a fortune hunter, or worse, a foolish girl dazzled by a title she did not understand. I see now I was entirely wrong on both counts." "I never wanted his title," Lynette said simply. "I wanted the man I met in the wood, before I knew he had one." "That," Lady Prudence said, with something that might, in a woman less proud, have passed for warmth, "is precisely why I have finally decided you deserve to keep him." Corizon Devey, for her part, recovered her composure with admirable speed, and within the year had accepted an offer from a viscount of considerable fortune and considerably less complicated affections, a match that suited her ambitions rather better than one built on a man's divided heart ever could have. Julian and Lynette were married the following spring, in the small chapel at the edge of Rothermere's grounds, with Agnes Farrow, her health slowly mending under her granddaughter's care, and the estate physician's newly humbled cooperation, seated in the front pew, weeping openly with a joy she made no effort to hide. The forbidden wood was forbidden no longer. Julian's first act as a married man was to open the gates permanently to any villager in need of its herbs, its shelter, its quiet, and to have the old boundary stone, the very one beneath which Lynette had once left coins for ground that owed her nothing, engraved with a simple inscription, understood fully only by the two people who had first met beside it: "What grows in secret is not always meant to stay hidden." Lynette continued to rise before dawn, though no longer in fear of discovery. Some mornings Julian rose with her, the Duke and Duchess of Rothermere walking together through mist-softened trees exactly as Jules and Lynette once had, gathering herbs, tending the sick, building a life neither title nor deception had ever managed to define. And though the county continued, for years afterward, to whisper the story of how their Duke had once disguised himself as a common gamekeeper to test the heart of a girl who gathered herbs in his forbidden woods, only Lynette knew the fuller truth of it, that he had not set out to test her heart at all, but had, quite by accident, in a mist-drenched hollow beneath ancient oaks, discovered his own. Agnes Farrow lived to see her first great-grandchild born the following winter, a girl with her mother's grey eyes and, Julian swore, her father's particular stubbornness already evident in the ferocity of her infant grip. The old woman held the child by the fire in the manor's east wing, a room Lynette had insisted be kept simple and warm rather than grand, over the protests of a housekeeper unaccustomed to a duchess, who preferred plain wool blankets to embroidered silk, and pronounced herself at last entirely satisfied with the life her granddaughter had built. "I worried, when you first told me of him," Agnes admitted, "that a man accustomed to taking whatever he wished would eventually tire of a wife who had nothing grand to offer him. I see now I misjudged which of you had more to offer the other. He did not rescue you from a hard life, my girl. You rescued him from an empty one, and taught an entire household, myself included, that a title is worth very little beside a heart honestly given." Lynette often returned, in the years that followed, to the hollow beneath the old oaks where it had all begun, sometimes alone at dawn out of old habit, more often with her daughter toddling unsteadily beside her, learning to recognize lungwort and willow bark the same way her mother had, though never once under threat of law or the fear of discovery that had shadowed those first uncertain mornings. Julian joined them when his duties allowed, no longer disguised as anything but exactly what he was, a duke who had once been foolish and frightened enough to hide behind a false name, and wise enough, in the end, to lay that falseness down before it cost him the truest thing he had ever found. The boundary stone still stood at the edge of the wood, its old inscription weathering slowly with each passing season, and villagers who passed it in later years, gathering herbs freely under the new duchess's standing invitation, would sometimes pause to read the words carved there, never quite certain of the fuller story behind them, though every one of them agreed the wood itself seemed gentler for whatever had once unfolded within its mist, a gentleness that had nothing to do with law, and everything to do with love, finally permitted to grow exactly where it had first, quietly, taken root,